These slides Lauren already has. I'm very happy for them to be shared with anybody, so feel free to click away as you want, but you can have the slides that are coming. I've titled this, of course, Patient Organizations. The talk's not all about patient organizations, of course. You've asked me to focus on our role thinking about an issue that you're all interested in, which is how do we improve the clinical trial arena. And that's what I'm going to get into. But I do want to spend a little bit of time thinking about EHA and patient organizations. As Lorna said, I've had a long involvement in this organization, and personally, I've got to say how incredible it is to see so many of you here today. It's incredible how this organization has grown in importance and strength in terms of representing the community as you do for lymphoma patients. And as a clinician, very involved in looking after lymphoma patients, I can't thank you enough for everything that you do to make things easier for many of those patients who aren't always as loud in advocating for their own care as the people in this room are. Okay, so a little bit just about EHA and how we think of the increasing importance of the patient organizations, and of course Natasha's on our patient advocacy committee, and any questions you have about what it really means and do we really listen to patient advocacy, you can talk to Natasha later. I'd of course like to thank everyone from the Lymphoma Coalition for this opportunity to be here and share the time with you today. I've certainly enjoyed sitting at the back listening to the discussions this morning. So, what is EHA? Well, EHA is the largest grouping of hematologists in Europe. ASH, of course, does the same thing in the United States. What differs in Europe, of course, is that each of the countries has their national societies, and then EHA is the overarching society that provides a voice for all hematologists. We like to believe, therefore, that we are the voice of hematologists, and that, to my mind nowadays, includes hematology patients advocating for what we want to do. So what are we interested in doing? Well, our goal is to, I think what you all want to, which is towards a cure for all blood disorders. I don't think you're so selfish that you only want the cure for lymphoma. I'm hoping you also want the cure for the other ones too, but I think we'll include lymphoma within that. Clearly, what we are doing is connecting hematologists, and I'd prefer to use the term the hematology community rather than thinking nowadays that we're using such a narrow label as hematologists, meaning physicians. That's too narrow a concept of what we're talking about now. We are clearly interested in supporting career development and research. We have a major interest in harmonization. An initiative there is that we have now something called the Hematology Passport, which harmonizes the hematology training required for hematologists throughout Europe. And there's now a hematology exam, which is held by EHA, which is now actually the national exam for instance, Switzerland uses the EHA exam to assess the training needs. So what we're interested in doing is ensuring that there's a very common level across all of Europe. What we also had, and something that was talked about a lot in your kind of breakout sessions this morning, is we clearly have a major role in advocating, and I spend more of my time now in Brussels than just very appropriate for Brexit, that I spend so much time in Brussels now talking to and advocating for and making sure that we as a community are heard within the people that make decisions about things. Now this is very important in terms of allocating resources towards hematology. We have to remember it's not just a case about science. We are talking here about going and advocating that the interests of hematology is equally as important as the wishes of farmers or fishermen. But these are the sorts of levels at which you have these sorts of discussions. So clearly we have a large number of activities. Most people know us for the annual Congress that we have every June, but that's only a small part of what we as an organization like to have, and we like to pride ourselves that we do. Natasha can correct me after you're out of the room, but I'm out of the room. But we do like to believe that we involve more and more the patient organizations, including yourselves, into making sure that what we are doing is fully aligned with what you want to do. And we've got a whole variety of things, including, of course, Hemisphere is our new journal. So the old way of interacting with patient organizations was that once a year in June we got together with patient organizations and had a meeting around a room with a couple of representatives and said yes, 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 patted you on the head, and then went back and didn't think about it for another year. Glad to believe that those days are over, and that's not the way that we look to involve now. So we've gone from, therefore, that Congress-only model to wherever needed, wherever possible, and as often as possible to engage the community like yourselves. Now, who exactly, what we mean by a patient organization that EHA can get involved with is quite a strict definition. It's a patient organization as recognized by the EU. Which of course you are, and that's one of the reasons why your organization is fully represented within what we're doing. That is coordinated through the European Affairs Committee, and we have an EHA patient organization work group, and it's as a member of that committee that Natasha sits as your representation within our board. We have annual EHA patient organization meetings on advocacy, EU projects, collaboration, and certainly when we are doing our advocacy track, and we have a whole office within the EHA organization that spends its whole full time thinking about how we can advocate at the Brussels level wherever possible, and we're always taking into account what the patient organizations are feeding back to. That's for two reasons. One, because it's the right thing to do. Secondly, because it's really useful. But thirdly, what's been very made clear to us is Brussels responds much more to you as in other words, the voter, than they do to an organization. So having voter representation, if you like, rather than organization, is a very powerful component of what we're able to do. And of course, the more we're able to show that we are actively engaging with the patient organizations, the louder our voice can become. So, in terms of all the things that we do in our research, our scientific relations, education, and harmonization, we feed through the European Affairs Committee, and then, of course, that's also where we get the feedback from the patient organizations. So, the emphasis in terms of advocacy is not on structures and procedural, but a real substantial involvement and collaboration. So patient centricity means that it's for and with the patients, and we believe, of course, that's a win-win policy. At the EHA Patient Joint Policy Symposium meetings, this replaced the advocacy track. I know this is an international group you have here, and not all of you focus on EHA, but I'm just talking here about ways in which we think about it. We have a patient advocacy track, or it used to be called the patient advocacy track. It's now the Patient Joint Policy Symposia at the annual meeting. We have 5 collaborative multi-stakeholder sessions which are patient-led, but supported basically by EHA with collaborative multi-stakeholder approaches to all sessions. And certainly it was great to hear about the PROMs this morning. We had a really good session last year that I spoke on patient-reported outcome, for instance, as one of the symposia that we did at the track. So I think we're seeing some really improved scientific content coming from those patient tracks. We've got increased involvement in key stakeholders, nurses, regulators, policymakers, hospital pharmacists, etc., to increase our coherence and all of that. We've got other collaborations. We wrote something called the Hematology Research Roadmap and published that several years ago. I think lots of us who were involved, including me, I was in part involved in writing the Lymphoma Research Roadmap for Europe. I had no idea what I was doing at the time. actually involved, but these research roadmaps are used by the people in Brussels to provide the framework for what you want to build going forwards, and they actually spend a lot of time looking at this and involving it in their planning for events going forward. There's a new research roadmap being put together now, and now that I really understand what it's for, we're going to work very hard at making sure that the things we're interested in are included in that research roadmap, because that's what's going to set the agenda for Horizon 2020 and 22, and is how the policymakers at Brussels set their budgets going forward. So very important document, and if you get asked to take part in this, think carefully about, it's not just about putting down where we are, but where we want to be. We have a whole variety of position papers. We have magnitude of clinical benefit scale guidelines coming out, where we are looking actively to have patient consultation. You can't measure clinical benefit scale doesn't just mean progression-free survival. It means everything in terms of how you feel as a community that things are improving for you. Harmony, of course, is the big data project that's occurring within Europe, and EHA is a partner in that. And we, in addition to the various roles that we have, support patient involvement within Harmony. For those of you who don't know what Harmony is, we can talk about it more. It's not the focus of what we're doing today, but there's a lot of fear, quite appropriately so sometimes, about big data. But it's by bringing data together into a single platform, we're able to really assess the sorts of outcomes that we're interested in trying to measure. And we also have clinical research roundtables. Now, why is all of that relevant to what you really asked me to talk about, which is thinking about increasing patient safety and data quality while also attempting to diminish bureaucracy? Well, there's nothing wrong with bureaucracy in clinical research. There's tons wrong in the over-bureaucratic mess that clinical trials have become right now, which have become a hindrance for all of us in terms of being able to move the field forward, and how is that truly needed. So to that end, in June of this year, we brought together a whole variety of key stakeholders around the table for the first time at the EHA headquarters in The Hague to discuss the bureaucratic obstacles in clinical research. And we brought together regulators. Natasha was there, so we brought in the patient organizations. We brought people from the European Commission. We had industry representatives invited who listened in but didn't so much actively contribute, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And we had a full day long discussion there, building an informal dialogue, particularly with EMA and the FDA, but that had been initiated by a group of prominent researchers. So just reminder there, pretty much the whole EHA executive board turned up for this meeting as a kind of example of how seriously we took this, and of course the whole executive office were there. EHA were there, FDA were there, the European Commission representations were there. We had key investigators, very prominent clinical trial investigators, and we had, of course, as already mentioned, the patient organizations. Not on that list is the people we invited from pharma. It's an interesting conversation that you heard about this morning, saying this double-edged sword. Now, we believe that pharma are not the enemy, or at least not always the enemy, but an active partner in what we're trying to do. But we're a bit more reluctant to want to not to actively participate in trying to tell EHA and FDA what to do, but much more interested in what we were trying to say in terms of moving these things forward. So we faced, at this meeting at least, three main challenges. The first one is on safety reporting. The second one is on the informed consent process. How many of you have taken part in clinical trials? How many of you could understand the patient information sheets provided? Quite. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a moment. And we talked about the regulatory processes. Now, this is a kind of double-edged sword. When clinicians came forward and started complaining bitterly, as we do, about the safety reporting mechanisms in clinical trials, you've got to be very careful. You can't stand there and say, this is far too bureaucratic a process. Nothing is more important than patient safety, and you can't just complain that it's become too complex to do it. But the real issue is that the current way that if you are the principal investigator of a clinical trial, you get notified about adverse events, is that you get now emails. And these aren't just emails that you see and receive. You get an email, you have to go in, log the adverse event, document that you read it, and file it, and then file it with your clinical trials office. That sounds very straightforward, but if I tell you that I can sometimes get 250 or 300 of these a day, what it tells you is that, I mean, I don't know how much time you spend reading emails, but what that means is that instead of receiving a vital, important information, we are so inundated with nonsense that you can't separate the important from the unimportant anymore. And that's been brought around by some, not changes in the regulations as you'll see, but changes in the interpretations of the regulations by a variety of people. And so many of us believe that these very important so if you've got patients on a clinical trial, and if there's a new agent in which there's a signal that there is a toxicity, it's hugely important that I can communicate that to my patients and to the team involved in the clinical trial, and we can be looking for it. But if I've missed it among the thousands of other things, that's not improving the safety for anybody. The other bureaucratic challenge that we face is these informed consent forms, as we talked about. Most of the feedback we get from patient now, having worked in the US for a long time, so how many of you are from the US and North America? So certainly, having spent half of my professional life working in the US and half working in Europe, I can tell you that there's a difference. And I'm glad to say that difference is becoming narrower and narrower. The oversimplified process is that patients came to see me at Dana-Farber with the New England Journal under their arm and questioned me about the clinical trials. The patients in Europe tend to say, yeah, doc, sign me up. That's a gross oversimplification, and people are becoming now much more involved in the clinical process. But many patients join clinical trials because they trust their doctors or because they trust you, who are advocating taking part in a clinical trial is an important thing to do for the optimal outcome of your disease. Now, many of the informed consent forms and their numerous amendments are therefore signed without really being read. And they are unnecessarily too long, too complex, and filled with information that is either not relevant or interesting. Now, when you take part in a clinical trial, it is very important that you are informed what it is you are doing and what you are not doing. Yeah? And they're very badly translated. That's also true. Well, everything about them is wrong. And the other thing, of course, is every single one I've taken to the scientific review panel has said, this form's too long, it's too complex, and we'd like you to add this, and this. So, every single time it gets reviewed I've never met a panel yet, other than a patient organization, that gets a form and said, let's take something out of this. All that happens is more and more and more and more gets added. I shouldn't name any companies, but have any of you ever taken part in a Roche Genentech trial? They're famous for their 55-page ICFs or PISs. So, and everything is in there. And of course, quite often, of course, you do have to be informed of what's happening, but sometimes, of course, it's so full of everything it can go wrong, you lose sight of what it is you're trying to achieve and what you're doing. There are also more and more standardized and defined laws that help to control the CROs, enemy number one, the clinical research organization, and eliminate the voids that allow them to overinterpret the legislation and increase the complexity of the project. Now, why is this important? Now, most clinical trials now, so if a clinical trial is being run by a pharmaceutical company, the sponsor hires a CRO, a clinical research organization, to run the clinical trial for them. We very quickly became aware that a CRO gets paid by the number of queries that are generated. Sponsors believe that the CROs are there to help us. If you incentivize somebody to say that there are problems, do you think they're going to help you with problems or they're going to create problems? I'll tell you which one I know they do. So that is part of the issue that what we're doing. Now, I included this slide in here directly. This was the slide from Fergus Sweeney, who's one of the doctors at the EHA, and this was from his own presentation. So what does all this come from? So there's an organization called ICH, or the International Committee of Harmonization, which is a process of making sure that clinical trials are regulated the same throughout the world. These are all following on from the original Helsinki Agreement. And they're in the process of being modernized. So this is a very timely time to get together to talk to the regulators about how we'd like to see amendments to that are going through ICH for the new version that will be preparing us for future medicines, future trial designs, and future data sources. And of course, we're now moving more and more into an era of what we call a personalized medicine. That is, you don't develop a drug for lymphoma, you develop a drug that targets EZH2 mutations, which might be present in a small subset of lymphomas, but present in others, cancers. So how do you then use a drug which would be useful for this patient when its license is being done in a different way? We were looking to emphasize the role of achieving quality by good design, and that good design should involve patients in terms of planning, and planning what's involved, how many visits do you need. You've got no idea how much data is collected in a clinical trial that is never used or even looked at ever again. But that's your visits, your blood, your samples being shipped off, all to what end? And we want to make sure that if we are subjecting a patient to a visit, we are subjecting a patient to a needle being put in their arm and blood samples being taken off, that it's all for value, that it's something that's going to be used. We want to ensure involvement of all parties, and you'll see here that the FDA themselves are saying, including the patients. So, patients should be involved in upfront study planning, not here's the study that's already involved, what do you think about it? But be actively involved in thinking about this. And we're looking to set the foundation for new study designs and data sources as we think about how we can incorporate. Why I was talking before about things like Harmony is that clinical trial data is increasingly going to be submitted into Harmony, and it's how that data can then be accessed and applied and thought about and collected in a way that's useful. So the 8th version of ICH, the General Considerations for Clinical Trial, was adopted in 1997. So I'd say there aren't any recent regulations, but there have been new interpretations of what those means. And what that's resulted in is that clinical trial design and conduct has become much more complex. Now, at one level, that's good because you've got increased regulation and safety, but this has had the expected consequence of meaning that a clinical trial takes much longer to complete than before. It's much higher to do the cost, and the more a clinical trial costs, the more the drug is going to cost when it's released, and the less access that people have in the markets where you don't have access to all of the drugs. And these are issues which are very important to us in the organization. So there's a wide range of both trial designs and data sources that play a role in drug development and that are not adequately addressed in the original guidelines, and therefore those need to be updated. So the approaches for optimizing clinical quality to promote the whole process becoming faster, sleeker, smoother, decreasing the bureaucracy in the way of a new drug coming forward, requires a patient focus on the clinical trials that are needed to identify the factors that are critical to the quality at the design stage and planning trial conduct proportionate to the risk. And this issue, proportionate to the risk, becomes important. If you're doing a very high-risk clinical trial, a phase 1 study with a very new drug where we don't know the safety, of course there needs to be very, very tight regulation. But if you're talking about a drug that's already approved and you're using it as the arm of a comparative clinical trial, does it really have to be run at exactly the same level that you would do that? Absolutely not. So thinking about reporting at the appropriate level. So as I say, this modernization of the ICH is the first step towards the GCP renovation. Now this was initiated in 2017. Now it's some of those steps that were initiated in 2017 that are giving me the headache that I've got every day in terms of my emails, because people have overinterpreted what the regulators are saying. And when we had the FDA and the EHA in the room, they were saying, we've never said that. We don't want that. So we can't blame EHA and FDA. We can blame something else. And one of the things I'm going to blame is this little part here. What we are interested in doing is we are interested in performing clinical studies to improve the treatment and to improve the outcome for our patients. We are interested in making sure that this is ethically safe and it's done very well. And we are interested in making sure that that data gets to the regulators in a way in which they can use the data to obtain authorization for a drug. What all of us want is, if a drug is successful, we want it approved, we want it licensed, we want it available to be able to use to patients who are not able to take part in the clinical trials. What has happened, of course, is the clinical trial has become about the sponsor, the investigator, and the CRO, and has moved more and more away from what all of us want to see from a clinical trial, which is a very timely way of getting a new concept to a drug licensed and approved to improve the outcome for our patients with lymphoma. And this whole process of these CROs and their SOPs, and I mean, every single time, it happens every day of the week in my hospital, I get a call from my clinical trial office saying the CRO are here in office and want to meet with you. My heart just sinks. And I've never met one of them once who comes and tells me, you're doing a really good job and we'd like to congratulate you for what you're doing. That's unfortunately never happened. So the whole variety of documents that were used and thinking about for discussion, and this one came from the EU, the EC regulators. So there are guidelines for good clinical practice in 2016. There are new EU regulations which are being worked for 2020. So that is a document for discussion. That is not a document yet completed. There are clinical trial facilitation groups. There's the original ICH 1995 document, and then the versions up to 2017. And there is data collection going on for the E19 optimization process. So when we think about looking at it right now, the keywords that are in there from the regulators is that we require a more selective approach to data collection management that should be adequate and optimal, and as long as the study objectives and the welfare of the patients are not compromised. The second statement is that although safety monitoring of patients during clinical trial remains important, unnecessary and burdensome data collection serves as a disincentive to participation in terms of too many clinic visits for our patients, too much laboratory collection, too many forms to sign that don't, signing again an amendment where the amendment makes, you've got patients having to sign consents to continue to take part in a clinical trial with an extra 20-page to read when they've already completed all the part of the clinical trial and they're only in follow-up, for instance. It's like, do you really need to know all of that information assess it and sign the thing. And a more selective approach to data safety collection may be adequate. So that's what the guideline says. The problem we've got is nobody's respecting that. Now, what's the consequence of that? Well, I've already told you, it's 250 emails a day for me, but that's not the issue. One argument should be I shouldn't be leading so many clinical trials and I'd have fewer emails. But it's a huge hold-up to moving things forward. The second thing is that there's no distinguishing feature now between a clinical trial that is being sponsored by a pharmaceutical company with very deep pockets and a clinical trial that's being run by an academic institution trying to figure out how do we improve the outcome and use this drug better. And increasingly, the academic centers are finding it almost impossible to engage as they would like in the clinical trial process as much as they would want. The issue is that despite the fact that the regulations were put in place to make things most safe, it says here many of us, almost all hematologists that I speak to who are engaged in clinical trials believe that research is less safe today than it was, because of the reason I've already told you. The deluge of unimportant information that follows the opening of a trial means that the truly important signals are lost. And there was a letter that went to the British Medical Journal in March of this year that was put together by Stephen Legrand and Simon Rule, that was signed by 900. They put the letter out saying, who wants to join this? And they got 971 professors around the world to join into that signature saying, this is getting out of hand, this is ridiculous. So a little reminder of what things are. So a SUSAR is a suspected, unexpected, and serious adverse event. And SUSARs are what we must report very quickly within a clinical trial and what we must know about in terms of new and important emerging signals. The trouble is that's what a SUSAR is supposed to be. Things are getting reported as SUSARs within the clinical trials. So here's example here, febrile neutropenia with vincristine. Well, that's listed on the information brochure for the drug. So it's not unexpected, it's not really serious, it's not something we want to be hearing, and not what we need to be thinking about. But if there's no changes to the conduct of a clinical trial, and things that are not SUSARs are just getting disseminated out there, we're going to lose what's being done. So in terms of working on solutions, we're looking to address the regulatory ambiguity. There's a collective response that we are gathering together to draft a whole series of questions and answers on clinical trial regulations on the EU document that we are sharing with the European Commission, and we have people going to that meeting going forward. We have a collective response to the ICH guidelines that we have shared with the EMA. The bad news for me personally is the EMA has moved out of London. The good news is it's now moved to Amsterdam, which means it's even closer to the EHA headquarters, so we are increasingly working with them. And the big thing I took out of the meeting was that EMA are not the enemy. They really do agree with us, and they're looking to work with us. We are looking to address the regulatory ambiguity by participating in a public meeting that's going to take place in October the 31st. And Stephen is going to, who was one of the people who put together the letter that went to the British Medical Journal, is going to be is our designated panelist from EHA to be present there. I mentioned this roadmap approach. So the roadmap is a high-level action plan, and we are going to ensure that we have input into thinking about this going forward and involve this whole process within something called the Biomedical Alliance. We want to give visibility to the topic and the related challenges. We want to organize a whole variety of smaller workshops devoted to finding solutions for the specific topics. And we want to make sure that we are able to draft a document including patient information sheets with our position, some guidelines, and to find solutions to work with the European Commission. It turns out that it is not the EMA and the FDA that set the rules and set the regulations. It's Congress and the European Commission that set the regulations. EHA and FDA were very much listening to us, willing to work with us. We've got to get our voice heard to help this going forward. So with that, just like to remind you all, a big meeting happening next year. It's the 25th Annual Congress in Frankfurt. For those of you who are there, hope you'll take part. I hope you're going to be actively involved, at least within the patient advocacy track at the meeting. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.